Don't forget while I'm reading that this is Harold speaking. As most of you know, I grew up in the northern Midwest. I was born in the early 50s, so growing up, as I think back, was in a pretty protective society. Other than learning the 10 Commandments and safety rules about crossing the street, social improprieties were never discussed amongst children. As a result, I never knew about abusive relationships, the effects of alcohol on relationships, early pregnancies, certainly not anything about gays, affairs, or historical events that may alter my understanding of my own heritage. All of these were topics that were not generally spoken about or passed over when they did arise. I believe we all learned about passing as we sat at our family tables. Passing food was a norm, everyone taking their part and sharing. Although sharing is an important part of passing, as we mature, the act of passing takes on a different meaning. The most notable may be the ability to pass the test by grasping subjects and moving on to the next task or grade level. In play, we learn to tag or pass the responsibility on to someone else. In poker, we pass if there's not a benefit to an action. We might have given a baton to the next runner as an act of passing with a shared goal of getting ahead. In some field sports, the act of passing becomes a strategy, the act to get ahead and achieve success. When we enter school and our social antenna goes up, we may want to acquire the fashion language of the crowds that attract us. We want to fit in. We want to pass the expectations of our newly found group. Sometimes we have to suppress our true feelings and opinions in order for this to happen. Just as passing becomes acquainted with camouflage in order to suppress ourselves and fly beneath the radar, society as a whole is doing the same thing. Certain topics are taboo and therefore just aren't talked about. It took time for all of this to come into focus. After seeing a movie about a young boy who was driven to petty crime due to the alcoholic dereliction and abuse by his father, I came to realize that some of the people I went to grade school with that were so disruptive came from these types of families. Even though their parents seemed normal at family events at the church, were they just passing? In the early years, during the 50s and 60s, any discussion of sex was done in hushed tones or humorous innuendos. Peggy Sue was going away to stay with her relatives for a while, or that fellow was light in his loafers. Who knew the Hollywood stars were gay? They were just funny people that seemed to fit in. Once, a scandal hit our community. A family man and member of our church died in a motel on the highway. He was accompanied by a woman that was not his wife. According to the woman, the man died of a heart attack while self-ingratiating himself. This was on the airways and headlines in my little town. Due to the notoriety of the story, my father decided we needed to have a talk. It went something like this. Dad, do you know what queer is? Me, yes. Dad, are you sure? Me, yes. At the point, I didn't know if it was a trick question, but I knew that complying was the fastest way to end the discussion, and I passed. But these are examples of the way people pass. I with agreeing that I knew, and the story of the man who was made to pass scrutiny of what had taken place, and the woman passing the eyes of the law by not admitting to any sexual involvement. It wasn't until the 90s, when the AIDS epidemic was in full bloom, that I gained a deeper understanding of what it meant to be gay. I have heard many accounts of people having to hide their sexual orientation, keeping it, as they say, on the down low. My involvement with a woman of color was similar. At first, keeping the relationship to myself not because of the fact I was dating, but because of who I was dating. I moved to Houston from a very narrow ethnic spectrum, white. Although in principle I was taught that we are all equal, talking and doing is totally different, especially as a relatively newcomer to the South. At the beginning of this relationship, the only mixed couple you may have seen is the people who lived upstairs on the Jeffersons on TV. Mixed couples were not the thing in the conservative environment where I was employed. Many a time, we seemed to stop conversations when we entered a restaurant, just like the old E.F. Hutton commercial. Time seemed to stop and all eyes were on us. I did not keep photos of my interests in my office. I was secretive about my weekends. I belonged to organizations that held all Caucasian members. They were certainly exclusive, and the idea that I was dating a black person was not anything that would gain me any acceptance, or so I thought. So I concentrated on passing as a good old boy. Not only did I have to pass to my white associates, but also to her friends, who were predominantly black, and I had to pass as a person who was cool with what may have been previously threatening. It was funny to me that after I had met some of her friends and family, she was questioned about whether I was from Louisiana. Apparently, there is more history with intermingling in Louisiana. But I wondered if me being from Louisiana would have been more plausible as to why a white person would be dating a person of color. Was that a story that would pass? Passing in the black culture is a term used regularly. Due to the one-drop rule established in the 1920s, if a person had one drop of black blood in their genealogy profile, they would be considered as black. There's a long history of abuses by owners of slaves that would produce lighter-skinned people. Over time, some would pass for white, and they did as a means to get ahead. While sitting at a black friend's house, I went through her family photo album and was surprised to see Civil War-era photos of her grandparents. As I turned the pages, skin tones changed, and soon I was looking at photos of people I would consider as white if I were tested. My friend told me that these people passed as white and owned a barbecue joint. So thorough was their desire to pass, they only allowed their dark-skinned cousins to eat out of the back door. That may seem cold to us, but let's think about this. Science continually points to Africa as the place where civilization started. It also presents evidence that all civilizations migrated from Africa. All the time I grew up, I was told that the people of Africa evolved from white to dark due to their proximity to the equator. My good friend and father-in-law confirmed that this is what was taught to him also. It is only logical that whiteness has evolved from the darkness of the Africans. So if you have a racist bone in your body, know this, that you too are passing. I have recently heard about what is called the religion of Christian whiteness, where the need to preserve the white culture and bloodline has precedent over the teachings of Jesus Christ. Critics, myself included, believe that when you no longer hold the ideals of the person you proclaim to be a follower of, you are no longer a disciple of the ideology and therefore should not use that title. In this case, Christian, in your description. This makes me think about us. If you look up liberal religion on Google, Unitarian Universalism pops up and is included in the description of a liberal religion. But are we? Do we rally around liberal causes just because they are the flavor of the day? Or do we fully understand the issues involved around being a minority, whether it's race, sexual preference, or identity? Do we practice being knowledgeable liberals? I like coming to this fellowship because we don't have to pass. We only have to ask the questions and learn from each other. Incidentally, I was amusing myself at a party by saying that I had a Louisiana complexion. Afterwards, a woman asked what part of Louisiana I was from. Apparently, there are a few people that look like me and have my color in Louisiana. Later that weekend, my partner was talking about some neighbors she grew up next to in Baltimore. They were black. Quote, but the wife was light and her color, she was like Harold, my partner said. Once again, I have passed.
So, due to some arbitrary characteristic, individuals are prohibited from enjoying or participating in certain aspects of life by other members of society who don't possess that arbitrary characteristic. Passing is when an individual is somehow able to hide or get around the arbitrary characteristic, either through some innate ability or deception. The other members of society often believe, or at least they claim to believe, that individuals with the specific characteristics are unworthy of full participation in society. These arbitrary characteristics can be fixed or stereotypical. Passing is much more difficult for individuals with fixed characteristics. For example, if you are denied opportunities because you are a woman or because you are extremely black, passing may be extremely difficult. On the other hand, if you are denied opportunities because you are gay, passing as straight is much easier because stereotypical characteristics are not so rigid. But individuals who are able to pass frighten those who are discriminating against them simply because they can pass. Once the passing individuals are on the inside, they might upset the balance of power as new members of the dominant group. And that's exactly what happens, because the arbitrary characteristics don't make any sense. And the individuals with the supposed inferior characteristics are actually perfectly capable of doing what they'd previously been prevented from doing simply because of the arbitrary characteristics. This is possibly why it was such a shock when leading man and heartthrob Rock Hudson came out as gay. He passed successfully for decades as a heterosexual male. But a greater fear for the controlling members of society may be the roles will be reversed, and they will be treated with the same indignities they inflicted on others, and they will lose their power in society. This was a tangible fear in South Africa when apartheid ended. But let's consider a passing situation a little closer to our everyday lives. As we sit here with our mostly white friends in a mostly white neighborhood, we don't need to pass in any way. But get into your car and drive a few miles into vastly different neighborhoods, and it becomes clear you don't pass any longer. You could be in a community where all the businesses have signs in an Asian language or in Spanish. Or you could be in a neighborhood where almost everyone you see is black. In all these situations, you no longer pass. And if you believe many of the erroneous stereotypes about the people who make up these specific neighborhoods, you might be afraid. You might fear that because you are different, you'll be harmed simply because you are different. It's not a good feeling. Fear is never a good feeling. There's often a great deal of shame that goes along with the desire to pass. At least it was for me. From as early as I can remember, every authority figure in my life said being homosexual was horrible and sinful. When I realized that's exactly what I was, I prayed for years for God to take it away from me. It never was. So I lived with the shame, and my only course of action was to hide and to try to pass as something I wasn't. My final year in college, the stress became too much to bear, and I decided to see a therapist. So I scheduled a session with one on campus at LSU. I vividly recall meeting with Mary Baker. She was about the age of my own mother, so she was someone I could immediately respect and trust. I remember telling her my shameful secret, that I was attracted to men. She calmly said, "That's okay, and it's nothing to be ashamed about. It's just who you are." It was as if a 10-ton weight had been lifted off my shoulders. She simply confirmed what I already knew to be true. At that very moment, I stopped needing to pass just a little, and the shame I'd lived with for years began to subside. Shortly after I graduated from college, had a job, and felt financially secure, I felt the need to come out to my parents. Prior to that, I feared coming out to them could be a problem if they cut me off financially. That often happens in the gay community, and I wasn't willing to risk it. But then I imagined hearing my mother exclaim, "If you're so proud of this lifestyle, why have you hidden it?" So I graduated in December, got a job in January, and came out to my parents in February. Coming out wasn't as bad as I anticipated because my parents loved me, and love can overcome many imagined problems. But hiding or passing is not easy or certain. And imagine being afraid that if you are discovered, you could lose your job. When I graduated from college in Baton Rouge, I had 3 job offers. 2 were near Baton Rouge, and the 3rd was in Houston. I accepted the Houston job, not because it was the best job offer or the job of my dreams. Those weren't even considerations. I took the job in Houston because I knew it would afford me the most opportunities for a gay lifestyle. Houston was huge, and I could hide in plain sight. But that didn't always work out. Just a few years after I moved to Houston, I was out on a date, attending a play at the Tower Theater in the Montrose, the gayest part of town, somewhere safe in my imagination. At intermission, my date got up and went to the restroom. Seated next to him were 2 of my coworkers, a husband and a wife. I went to college with the woman, so they absolutely knew me. I was shocked and scared simultaneously. What were the odds? To the best of my knowledge, nothing ever came of that chance encounter. Fears don't always come true, but sometimes they do. And early in my career, being outed was a legitimate fear. The talk I heard around the office about gays or being gay, or even the men they were stereotypically as being gay, was not kind. On the other hand, those men who I knew to be gay, but who weren't stereotypically gay, rose in the ranks of employment all over town. This fear never really went away, but it greatly decreased over the years. At my last job in Mississippi, I didn't advertise the fact that I was gay, but I didn't hide it either. Then Randy had a major health issue, and there was no way I could avoid it any longer. I soon discovered that everyone knew I was gay and no one cared in the least. And this was in redneck central Mississippi. Life has indeed changed over the course of the last 30-plus years. But let me emphatically claim, having to pass in order to succeed is both exhausting and frightening. I empathize with anyone who feels the need to pass in order to get ahead. A person seeks to pass for access to what you might be denied if it were known who you really are. That access is for many things like jobs, other opportunities, friendships, and all too often, safety. But another part of passing includes guilt and shame experienced by the person who is passing in some way. The guilt is for being able to pass when others, for a variety of reasons, can't pass, and so others must deal with society's injustices. And for me, the guilt led to shame. Shame for not having the courage to openly be who I really was. I had the courage to come out to my parents, but not the rest of the world. So I always felt some shame knowing I could pass when others couldn't. And some people are very conflicted with their needs to pass or not. I have no idea how accurate the recent movie Maestro about the life of Leonard Bernstein, the famous conductor, was. But the movie portrayed a very conflicted man, one who was courageous and unwilling to hide the fact that he was Jewish by simply changing his name and thus pass and be more acceptable to the musical world of that day. But he also had no problem flaunting his bisexuality and multiple affairs with men right in front of his wife, while at the same time needing to lie and to pass as both a faithful husband and as straight for his children. And then there is the very opposite of passing, trying desperately to live your life authentically as who you know and feel you are. Those people are truly courageous, and I'm talking specifically about trans people. People born either male or female, but they know deep down inside that they are actually female or male. Initially, they try to pass as the other sex by wearing the appropriate clothes and hair, and also by adopting the expected mannerisms. And when possible, they make passing permanent with hormones and operations. All of this is in a quest to be authentically who they know they truly are. Tragically, all too often society won't allow them. In an article written and published by Jamie Wareham, she says, 320 trans and gender diverse people were killed in 2023. The Trans Murder Monitoring Report tracks murders reported in the media each year. The vast majority of those killed in 2023 were trans women or trans feminine people. Most were black, and many were sex workers. 80% of those killed were of trans people affected by racism, an increase of 15% from the previous year. Many of the victims were young. The age group with the most victims was 19 to 25 years old. Overall, those between 19 and 40 years old made up 3/4 of those killed. So let us make sure you understand the reality here. These were trans individuals who were females. They dressed and looked like women, and yet other individuals discovered their secrets and murdered them. These women were not passing. They were being who they authentically were, and yet they were murdered for it. In conclusion, my hope and my prayer is that someday passing won't be necessary for anyone, anywhere, because everyone will be accepted and safe to be who they are or who they need to be. But until that day comes, we can be friends and allies to them in our church and in our society at large. Amen and namaste.